Hello and welcome to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are focused this week of May 11th to talk about actually something that happened on May 11th, 1926. And this was the first meeting, at least we think so, was the first meeting of the Inklings. And we're going to talk about who the Inklings were. There were more than two, Inklings, and who all is involved in that, and primarily to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and to be able to talk about C.S. Lewis is probably our lead conversations on that. And we are very glad to have with us Professor of Theology and Religion at Oxford University, Dr. Michael Ward, who has written extensively on these and has got a good bit of study and time and effort into that is going to share some knowledge with us. So, Dr. Ward, thank you so very much for participating with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nick, for having me. Glad to be with you.
Absolutely. So tell us then just what the heck is an inkling and who were they and how did that kind of get started and give us a little background on that.
Yeah, well, the Inklings really grew out of the friendship between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And as you say, it was in May 1926 that they first met, or at any rate, that we have a recording, a report, an account of that first meeting. It's there in Lewis's diary. He
Mm,
said that at an English faculty meeting, so he and Tolkien both were teaching in the English faculty at Oxford, that he had met a chap called Tolkien, and Lewis described him as a pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so. So that was a rather inauspicious first meeting, and you wouldn't have guessed from that that they would go on to be great friends and
mm,
hugely, hugely, hugely influential on each other.
mm.
And, between them, establish or sort of re-establish for the 20th century um, fantasy literature in a Christian register, which would go on to have a global audience,
Mm.
both in book form and in cinematic form, and they would establish the kernel, the core of the group that would grow up around them, which came to be called the Inklings. And they chose the name Inklings partly because it was already the existing name of a group in Oxford, which sort
Uh,
of faded out of existence, and then Lewis and Tolkien sort of took it over. And they like the name because Inklings suggests people with thoughts or notions, but also suggests rather, amusingly, those who dabble in ink. That was Tolkien's explanation for the name anyway. And it was really after, so they met in 26, but it wasn't really until 29 that Lewis and Tolkien became really good friends when they
mm,
started sharing works in progress with each other. And it was soon after that that C.S. Lewis became a Christian. He had been raised a Christian, but had called himself
mhm,
an atheist for about 20 years.
mhm.
And then it was in his early 30s, thanks to the input of Tolkien and another friend called Dyson, that Lewis returned to the practice of the Christian faith. And thereafter, the friendship between the two men really took root and gave rise to not only the Inklings, but to all their works, both fictional and non-fictional, that they wrote thereafter.
How about that? Well, so when they are um, communicating with each other back and forth and talking about their various works and their and where their ink was or their typewriter ribbon or whichever way it may have been, right? That they were was it the kind of thing where Lewis says to Tolkien, hey, I really think you ought to make Gandalf look a little bit more like XYZ instead of ABC. I mean, was it that kind of intimacy conversation that they knew what each other was working on, or was it more a general dialogue and a back and forth with obviously some people who were at a much higher intellectual level than I, but they just picked up on ideas from each other about, hey, that you kind of struck me about something you said about that. And I think I'm going to integrate that into character this that I'm working on. That's a loaded big question, I know, but I've
Yeah, well, it was everything really. I mean, they were very close friends, they were close colleagues. They saw each other several times a week, at least during term time, and
mm,
probably fairly frequently out of term as well, because they were both living in Oxford as well as working in Oxford. Um, and they met um, more socially on usually Tuesday mornings in a pub in Oxford called the Eagle and Child. And that was largely a social meeting where they would just talk college politics and shop and hang out with each other, drink a few glasses before lunchtime. Um, and then more seriously, the sort of writing component of the book, the compositional aspect of the friendship and of the group, more largely happened on Thursday evenings when they would meet
mm,
in C.S. Lewis's college rooms, and that's when they would read aloud the latest chapter of whatever book they were writing, and that would give rise to extempore criticism, comment, back and forth, often very full on. It was not a mutual admiration society. They were not there just to soft soap each other and say, "Oh, how marvelous! You're even more marvelous than I am." No, there was no holds barred. And in fact, Tolkien once said that sometimes if a stranger had come into the meeting, they would have thought that the assembly was of mortal enemies hurling insults at each other, because they knew and trusted each other so well that they could say anything that came to
mm.
mind, knowing that the other person would not be offended. One or two members of the group, one in particular, sometimes exceeded the bounds. We might come on to
Ah,
that later, but generally, Lewis and Tolkien, yeah, they were sharing everything, their thoughts, their ideas, their works in progress. And so, I mean, with regard to the Lord of the Rings, especially,
hmm.
Tolkien said that without Lewis's endless encouragement, he would not have completed it.
Wow.
He says that in a number of places. And given that The Lord of the Rings has gone on to be voted repeatedly as perhaps the greatest work of literature of the 20th century,
Mm,
the fact that Tolkien says it would not exist but for Lewis's input is a major acknowledgement of a debt.
wow. So these Thursday evenings were more than just the two of them. I mean, there were others that were able to come join back in some of Lewis's rooms for the conversation, and
Yes.
they kept
Yeah.
that separate. You could be in the Tuesday morning social, hey, what's going on with this crazy dean or whatever else you might be talking about, but then Thursday, look, we're getting down to business in here. This is really kind of, or is it more relaxed or maybe not as structured?
Yeah, there was very little structure. Um, the basic distinction between the two meetings, the Tuesday morning and the Thursday evening, was, as I just said, that Tuesday morning was more purely social, Thursday
Hmm.
evening was more deliberately to discuss their works in progress. Um, but there was never any formal agenda, and there was
Mm,
never any formal membership list either. The circle was very various in its constitution. Different friends came sometimes for a period and then stopped coming, or some friends came almost every time, especially
mm,
C.S. Lewis's brother Warney. He was a very regular attender, but a person who is often listed as one of the major Inklings, Owen Barfield, actually came very little because he lived in London.
huh,
So he just wasn't around to attend the meetings, even though he was a close friend, especially of Lewis's, and had been, influential on both Lewis and Tolkien through an early book he wrote called Poetic Diction. So it was a very various, sort of informal group. Um, and, in a way, they hardly thought of themselves as a significant gathering. I mean, Oxford is full of small groups of friends and colleagues gathering for one purpose or another, for one period or another. And indeed, Lewis and Tolkien were members of other groups. Lewis was part of the Dante Society. Tolkien was part of a group called the Coalbiters, who gathered together to study also old Icelandic literature.
wow.
So the Inklings, although it's now incredibly famous and incredibly influential, was just one of many groups that they belonged to at the time. And they would probably be very surprised that now in 2026, and there are podcasts being devoted to a discussion of this circle.
Literally a century later, right? I mean,
Mm.
because we're right on the 100th anniversary, right, of all of that too. I don't do much math because I'm in the liberal arts, but I think I figured that one out. Okay, at least that's about where we are. So what's who were some of the other people that we might know their works or their or as an author or somebody else that would have periodically either been consistently a part of the Inklings or maybe they were just there for a season or a time or something?
Mm. Well, as I just mentioned, Lewis's brother Warren, Warney as he was called, he became something of a writer himself. He published 6 books of French history. Owen Barfield wrote a lot of books of various kinds, but as I say, he hardly ever attended.
Mhm.
Even though he's often regarded as one of the key members of the group, he wasn't really. There were some very regular attenders like Robert Havard, who was actually the doctor, the medical doctor that both Lewis and Tolkien went to for,
Huh.
their medical needs. But he became a friend, and but he wasn't really a writer as such. I mean, he may have published a few small things, but nothing significant.
Okay.
And then there were then for a season, really only during the Second World War, so about 1939 to 1945, a significant member of the group was Charles Williams, and
Hmm.
he was, quite well known as a writer, as an editor, as a novelist, as a poet, uh, and he was very close with Lewis, but then he died rather unexpectedly and suddenly in 1945. He was only 58, I think, at the time. He was my age.
Wow.
Um, and uh, and so that was the end of his involvement in the group. Um, the group really went on until the late 40s for the Thursday evening meetings, and then they drew to a close. But the Tuesday morning meetings went on for a lot longer. One of the reasons why the Thursday evening meetings came to an end was, as I just indicated a moment ago, there was one member of the group, Hugo Dyson, who really hated the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, really?
He had no patience with the Lord of the Rings. So when Tolkien was there reading aloud the latest chapter of the book, if Dyson was present, he would sort of yawn extravagantly and show how bored he was. And on one occasion, famously or infamously, he's reported to have said, um, well, he was reported to have uttered an expletive,
Mm.
um, and then said, "Oh, not another effing elf."
Great.
But he had no patience for the elves, for Rivendell and Lothlorien. He just thought it was all nonsense and, fantastic in the worst sense of the word. Um, and because of that, Tolkien wouldn't read in his presence anymore.
Ah,
So if Tolkien had begun reading and then Dyson turned up late, Tolkien would just fold his manuscript and put it away and shut up. Um, and one of the great scholars of the Inklings, Diana Glyer, who's written a great book called The Company They Keep, all about
mm,
this group, she remarks, I think very perceptively, that it was in large part, or in no small part, because of Dyson that the group began to fade on the Thursday evenings, because Dyson was sort of attacking the raison d'etre of the group. The
mm,
whole point of the group was to expose before everybody else the intimate workings of their imagination. And if all you get is scorn and derision in return, well,
right.
obviously you're not going to do that so readily. And so Dyson, I don't think he realized necessarily what he was doing, but he was actually undermining the whole group. And so, as I say, the Thursday evening meetings came to an end in the late 1940s.
Well, there's a line between, derision and constructive criticism, right? And so as long as everybody knows, hey, I'm giving you, I know kind of where all of my fellow friends here are kind of coming from, if you will, and I know that they are giving me input because they want me to do well, right? Or
Yeah,
they're trying to be helpful is altogether than being just some naysayer nabob all day long, right? That is just
yeah.
Yeah, complaining. Who wants to be around that cat? I don't know who would. Right? I
Yeah,
wouldn't. Right. Right.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Hey, we're
And then
enjoying our conversation that we're having here with Dr. Michael Ward, and we're having some great dialogue about the Inklings and about their impact as well. So, but is that so? The group would kind of ebb and flow. It's not like somebody was keeping roll or something. Nobody was saying, "We're kicking you out. We haven't seen or heard from you in 3 weeks." I mean, it's not like people were texting each other, right? Or they were making Facebook posts or other things that were involved in that. It's just if you found value, if you were like this physician maybe who said, "Look, I really enjoy kind of being a fly on the wall," right? I mean, who of us wouldn't have been, right? I mean, but even still, so it could have been part of that that kind of made the group go back and forth.
yes, absolutely. There was a purely social dimension to it. If you just enjoyed the other people's company, you would turn up. And if there was a bit of a temperamental clash, then you turn up a bit less often.
Yeah,
Um, but in addition to Diana Gleyer's book that I just mentioned, The Company They Keep, the other best account of the group is the biography by Humphrey Carpenter. It's just called The Inklings. Um, there's also a more recent book by Philip and Carol Zaleski, which is also, I think, called The Inklings. So those are the places to go to if people want more details. Um, in total, people reckon there are a sort of I think 19 sort of recognized people
ah,
who were sort of acknowledged as being members of the group, as opposed to occasional visitors to the group.
got it.
Because so there were these 19, and then there were other odds and ends who just popped in for a meeting here or there, but were never considered members. But as I say, even those who consider themselves members were never sort of officially enrolled on any
Right.
register. It was all very much more informal than that.
No secret handshakes, no knocks on the door that you had to get right or anything else like that to get in, right?
Yeah,
Nothing
yeah,
like
yeah,
that. Well, but now Tolkien was a very devout Roman Catholic, right? I mean, and Lewis not so much, right? So I mean, did any of that kind of play into their thought processes about or is it was more general Christianity is kind of where they came from.
yeah.
Not so much theology or doctrine or something.
Well, I think they discussed everything under the sun, actually, and they didn't draw the line at religious matters, let alone at denominational matters that separated the Anglican Lewis from the Catholic Tolkien. I mentioned the sort of inauspicious first reference to Tolkien in Lewis's diary. There's a
Hmm.
similarly sort of comic reference to him in Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy. And I'll just quote it to you. I happen to have it up in front of me. Friendship with Tolkien, Lewis says, friendship with Tolkien marked the breakdown of two old prejudices. At my first coming into the world, I had been implicitly warned never to trust a papist, and at my first coming into the English faculty at Oxford, explicitly warned never to trust a philologist. Tolkien was both. But for all that, as I say, they became tremendously close friends. Um, the, the best source for an analysis of their friendship on religious matters is Holly
Hmm.
Ordway's great book, Tolkien's Faith, a spiritual biography, which I recommend very heartily. Um, and she talks about those occasions when, in the Inklings, they would get on to matters religious or theological, and sometimes it would touch upon a fault line between the Catholics in the group and the Protestants, because it wasn't just Tolkien who was the Catholic. There about maybe a quarter or a third of the members were Catholic. Um, in fact, again, this is a point of contention with Dyson. Dyson was an Anglican and rather anti-Catholic, and he once apparently said that he would leave the group if any more damn papists joined.
I might have gone and recruited a few, right? I might have gone.
Yeah,
Maybe they should
uh,
have found the parish priest and brought him in, right? And then
yeah,
said, the
yeah,
archbishop's coming next week. See if you're going to stay around for that.
yeah. I mean, But Lewis was always very broad-minded, and as you know, he wrote a book called Mere Christianity, which focuses in on the things which unite Christians of different traditions. And so, although he was occasionally prepared to thrash out some of these issues in meetings of the Inklings, it was not something that he dwelt upon either in private friendship or in his public writings. And Tolkien didn't write on theological matters really at all.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, it was it must have been a really lively and invigorating experience to attend these meetings. And indeed, one of the junior members of the group, John Wayne, not the film actor,
Right.
but John Wayne with a Wain, he's written a little bit about those meetings, and he said, sometimes if the duller members of the group were in the majority, the evening would fall a bit flat. But the best of the meetings, he said, were such as I shall never live to see again, or
Ah,
words to that effect. When everything was just throbbing and thrilling with intellectual and imaginative vivacity and wit and wordplay and cut and thrust. It must have been superb.
yeah. Don't you wish they were all recorded, right? But that would be it probably would have dampened the amount of dialogue that was going on at the same time too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what about, are there specific things, let's just say in the Narnia books, that we could go back to and say, here's a spot when this happened. Here's where Tolkien actually, or maybe any of the other Inklings, may have influenced the way Lewis, the way we now see that, or the way we now read about that. That, previously it was an XYZ, but now it's an ABC, and that happened because he
Yeah.
factored into that. I'm sure there's examples of that.
Well, there are examples of that with regard to the Lord of the Rings, that
Ah, okay.
for all that Tolkien sort of suggested he was uninfluenceable, and for all that Lewis actually said that Tolkien was uninfluenceable, that we can show, I think, pretty clearly that Lewis did influence the Lord of the Rings
Hmm.
significantly in a number of respects. Um, Lewis was always saying to Tolkien, we need less Hobbit talk. We need less sort of silly, cozy hobbitry. Hobbits are only interesting, Lewis said, in un-Hobbit-like situations. So yeah, by all means, paint the Shire and Hobbiton and show us what a lovely rural pre-industrial world it is, and dwell upon the characteristics of the hobbits with their curly hair and their hairy feet and their love of long meals and second breakfasts and all the rest of it. But don't overdo that.
Hmm.
Hobbits become interesting when they're under threat, when you put them at risk, and that's when their real character shines forth.
Hmm.
And I think Tolkien, without that advice from Lewis, would have given us much more of sheer hobbitry, which Tolkien said, he was amused by. He said he could entertain himself almost endlessly watching the hobbits make their sort of fatuous jokes. Um, but I must curb this severely, Tolkien said, because Lewis and one or two other critics told him he was overdoing it. And there was also much more about languages
Hmm.
um, in the original, or there would have been if Tolkien had had his way. So some of that material was kept, but removed to the appendices. So it wasn't wasted, but it
Hmm.
resulted in the Lord of the Rings being a much tighter and more dramatic story. Lewis was always a one for a story, Tolkien said, and that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet. Um, so it's not just that Lewis nagged Tolkien to get it finished. Lewis also really helped bring out the stronger features of the narrative, which Tolkien would otherwise, I think, have allowed to get swamped with other things which readers would have found, less engaging and less exciting. As for the influence the other way round, there's not really much to say about Tolkien's influence on Narnia because Tolkien didn't like Narnia.
Huh.
You
Okay.
know, Lewis loved The Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien had very little patience with Narnia. Lewis read aloud the first couple of chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to Tolkien as he was drafting them, but Tolkien didn't much like what he was hearing. Um, Now, this dislike, which I think was, real but moderate and mild, has grown in the telling, so that it's like the game telephone.
Mm,
With each successive biography that is written about Lewis or Tolkien or the Inklings as a group, this dislike of Tolkien has become enlarged and exaggerated, so that in recent accounts, it's not that he dislikes it; it's that he detests it, that he
mm.
can't find a single good thing about it, that it makes him apoplectic. Um, and there's no evidence for that. Again, my friend and colleague Holly Ordway has done excellent work at analysing how this myth has grown in the telling. You can find that lecture she gave at George Fox University in Oregon online, where she just takes down this whole silly story. But it is true that Tolkien disliked Narnia, and I think for two main reasons. One was that he thought that the work was a bit of a jumble,
Mm.
that there were English children alongside characters from Greek and Roman mythology, alongside Father Christmas, alongside
A
um,
talking beaver, or I mean, or
a talking
whatever.
beaver, yes, talking animals, and a white witch out of Hans Andersen. And, Tolkien thought this wasn't really consistent enough. It was certainly very different from Tolkien's way of going about writing Middle Earth, where he thought that everything should have what he called the inner consistency of reality. Whereas Narnia is, in comparison, a bit of a hodgepodge on the face of it. Now, I believe actually that there's a deep consistency, a sort of hidden consistency at a fundamental level, which means that Narnia is not actually slapdash or a mishmash. And perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment. But
Mm.
whether I'm right about that or not, Tolkien certainly didn't see it, and Lewis didn't tell Tolkien what he was up to, um, which might strike some people as strange, but
Mm.
then it must also be noted that when C.S. Lewis got married, he didn't tell Tolkien for the best part of a year. The marriage was
Wow.
secret to Joy Davidman, and Tolkien was a bit hurt about this when he finally discovered it. So Lewis and Tolkien, although they were great friends, they didn't tell each other absolutely everything about the inner workings of their imaginations. Um, but another reason why Tolkien seems to have disliked Narnia is that he thought that the what you might call the allegorical aspect of the story was a bit too obvious. So,
Mm.
Aslan, the Lion King in the Narnia books, is fairly clearly an a parallel to or a representation of Jesus Christ. And Lewis talked about that in a number of articles and letters. He wasn't trying to pretend it didn't exist.
Huh.
um, but Tolkien had a hearty distaste of allegory, and always denied that the Lord of the Rings was allegorical in any way. So that's another possible reason why he seems to have found Narnia outside what he called his range of imaginative sympathy. But he
Okay.
also said that the books were deservedly very popular, and he kept copies of them at his home so that his grandchildren could read them when they visited him. So he clearly didn't think the books were worthless. He just said that they were, not his kind of thing. And indeed, he says also, not everything I wrote did C.S. Lewis like, but this didn't
Right.
impinge upon our friendship. So the idea that Tolkien absolutely loathed Narnia and that it ruined their friendship, as some people have said, is quite untrue.
Mm. Well, let's talk about that. I'd love to talk more about that allegorical piece, and kind of the way that fits into the way many people would might be able to view and for the most part view the films, right, on the cinematic part of it. And I would say that would probably has way more impact than the people being. I haven't read all three of the Lord of the Rings, but I've seen all three of the movies. I
Mm.
mean, so it's but talk to us a little bit about what you were saying, this underpinning about Narnia and about
Mm.
how that really is consistent and part of that from Lewis's perspective.
Yeah, well, from Tolkien onwards, really, people have kept coming back to this notion that the Narnia books don't seem to have any very obvious imaginative blueprint. They don't seem to have the coherence that you might expect of someone like C.S. Lewis, who was, a very rigorous and consistent thinker. He had a brilliantly trained mind, a very well organized mind, a disciplined imagination. And so, is it really likely that, as some people have said, he just slopped Narnia together without
Mm.
any care or forethought? Some critics have said that the books are a jumble, slapdash, that Lewis wrote in a glib, easy come, easy go, slap it down kind of way. Um, but that's not how Lewis thought or worked in everything else that he did. In fact, he loved complexity and intricacy of all kinds. And indeed, I've come across a number of places where he said that he likes works which give the appearance of being unplanned while
Ah.
all is planned. He says that's an aspect of the medieval imagination. The medieval imagination, he says, is labyrinthine. Everything leads to everything else, but often by very intricate paths. And as a medieval scholar himself, C.S. Lewis, I think, imitated that example when he was writing Narnia. So he gives
Hmm.
superficially, it looks, yes, it can't be denied. On the surface, the story does look like it's been assembled out of very various component parts, but the inner meaning is carefully hidden, as Lewis once said about one of his earlier works. And I think the inner meaning of Narnia, too, is carefully hidden. It's actually constructed out of the symbolism of the seven heavens. Now, the seven heavens, or the seven planets of the medieval cosmos, were a thing that Lewis studied intimately as a scholar. He writes about it in his book, The Discarded Image, as a literary historian. He uses the imagery extensively in his Ransom trilogy of novels, and he writes a long, complicated poem about the seven heavens, simply called The Planets, in which he analyzes all the planetary attributes and influences very carefully. And he once said that the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is
Mm.
especially worthwhile, he said, in his own generation. And it's my belief, this is what my book Planet Narnia is all about. It's my belief that the seven chronicles of Narnia are actually keyed to these seven spiritual symbols, as he called them. So that Aslan, the Christ character,
Hmm.
becomes the true Jupiter. Jupiter is the king, and Christ is the King of Kings. Or Aslan becomes the true Mars. Mars is the god of war, but in the Bible, God is the Lord of hosts, mighty in battle, and the Christian life is
Hmm.
often depicted in military terms. Put on the whole armor of God, fight the good fight, be a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Or in the Dawn Treader, Aslan is the true sun. So the sun was one of the medieval planets. And if you think in biblical terms, Jesus says, I am the light of the world in John's
Hmm.
gospel. So this solar imagery is also very scriptural.
Hmm.
And so on, seven times over. Lewis finds in medieval planetary symbolism a set of qualities and attributes which he then uses to provide each book with its hidden meaning, its atmosphere, its flavor, its tone, which he never asks us to consciously recognize. He asks us to inhabit it, to live inside that atmosphere
Mm.
and, as it were, breathe it in and know it from inside. And that, in fact, is a really important distinction in Lewis's thinking, that we know things not just from the outside, from observing them at a distance. The deeper way we know things is through embracing them and allowing ourselves to be embraced by them. Knowledge by acquaintance, what he
Hmm.
called enjoyment knowledge. and looking along the beam of light rather than looking at it from the side. And that's what he's up to in Narnia, I think. We are meant to have a sort of intuitive grasp that
Hmm.
there is a unity, even though we can't quite put our finger on it. Um, so
So
anyway,
it's kind of like if I wanted to learn, oh, I'm sorry. If I was going to try to learn a language and I want to learn Spanish, there's only so much I can get by being in the classroom and listening to some Berlitz tapes or something. But I go
mm,
spend a year in Barcelona, I'm going to be in a totally different place, right, than
mm,
I would know otherwise. So it's an experiential, I'm breathing it, I'm about it, this is where I am, and now I'm getting it at a different level that I wouldn't get it at otherwise. And so if I'm spending time on Mars, so to speak, then
yeah,
I'm picking up this, what it means to be able to go to battle. When I'm trying to fight whatever it is I'm trying to fight, evil in this
yeah,
sense and others, then I'm experiencing that on a totally different level. And
yeah,
that's kind of the weave. Am I picking up that you're saying, yeah, that's really where it wasn't just so much, oh, the Lion of Judah, Aslan, Lion King.
mm,
Okay, well,
mm,
maybe any number of us might be able to catch that one. Okay, that's not, but his
yeah,
is deeper than that. And to say Lewis is a guy that was always going deeper than that on any number of subjects would be consistent with him too. Is that
absolutely.
fair, or is
Yeah.
am I off in crazy land?
No, you're absolutely on the money. That's entirely what he's up to. Um, and it's an important part of his spirituality as a
Mm,
Christian that, you know, we as a Christian is not just someone who knows about God, who studies Christianity from the point of view of a religious historian or a sociologist of religion. Um, you can study Christianity like that. You
sure.
you can read all the books of theology. You can read the Bible as just a sort of historical, sociological document, but that won't make you a Christian, because a Christian is someone who commits to this knowledge and this belief and this love and this service and this obedience, enters into a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ in the Holy Spirit. And indeed, the Holy Spirit is a good sort of theological equivalent to what we're talking about with regard to the atmosphere of a story. That
Mm,
in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you're sort of breathing in this atmosphere, this literary atmosphere, just as, in the Gospels, Jesus breathes on the disciples and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And they
mhm,
take the Holy Spirit almost literally inside them, so that their whole worldview is colored and it's like a lens through which they see the whole of reality. And you don't, with a pair of glasses, I'm now looking at you through my spectacles. A good pair
mhm.
of glasses is a pair you don't notice. If I'm looking not
Right,
through my lenses, but at my lenses, then obviously I'm going cross-eyed. A good lens is invisible,
uh,
but it brings everything into focus. And that I think is exactly what Lewis is trying to do with these planetary symbols. They're invisible. He doesn't draw our attention to them, and yet it's through them that we are seeing the whole Narnian world in each of the seven books. It's a brilliant thing that he did, and I think it's actually unprecedented in the whole of literary history. There are lots of authors who have given us Christ characters, and there are lots of authors who give us atmospheres in their
mm,
stories. But I don't think anybody has before Lewis made the atmosphere and the Christ character out of the same symbol or same set of symbols, of Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, Saturn, and the Moon.
mm,
Those are the seven heavens. And it's from those seven that we take the names of the days of the week. So, although we have discarded this image of the cosmos, that's what Lewis's book, The Discarded Image, is all about. We no longer believe the universe to have just seven planets. We no longer think of the moon and the sun as planets. We now know about Neptune and Uranus and Pluto, and we now think that we live in a solar system with the sun at the center. We go around the sun. The sun doesn't go around us as used to
right.
be believed. So we've moved on from that model of the cosmos scientifically, But Lewis thinks that these seven spiritual symbols are of permanent value. They're like archetypes in the human imagination. They keep
Hmm.
cropping up under different guises in every generation. So that, we talked about Mars, you think of the strong man, the fighting warrior for the ancient Romans. Well, what's, think of Superman or any other great martial hero, fighting warrior, even Rambo, uh, the sort of less positive aspects of the martial character. Or, think of Aphrodite, Venus for the Greeks and Romans. And, in the 20th century, C.S. Lewis was surrounded by images of Marilyn Monroe, the gorgeous, sexy woman, the sort of avatar of fertility and beauty. Um, these things recur in the human imagination, and that's one of the reasons why Lewis valued them so much.
Wow. Well, let's talk real quick before we end our time here. One of the things I wonder about, and now that particularly let's go back and talk about Tolkien and about um, archetypes and others on whether he was actually attempting to do that or not in his books,
Mm.
to be able to show some veiled Christianity in part of that, or was it? No, he just thought it was a cool character that this guy comes in from the comes in from
Mm.
the east in the same way that Jesus, when he comes back, whatever. I'm just pulling that one out of my ear. But that was really not Tolkien's piece. Is that what you're saying? He was not into trying to find some allegorical component. He was just, now the fact that you may have picked up on something and seen that by yourself, that's your thing. That's not necessarily his thing. Is that kind of right or no? Or is that a silly
Uh,
question?
well, in C.S. Lewis, I've picked up on the planetary imagery, which
Right,
I
right.
think,
But I mean in Tolkien in
yeah,
particular,
but
right?
in Tolkien, um, a given reader who who is alive to Christian themes, Christian characters and motifs and symbolism might recognize, for instance, that the lembas bread, the way bread of the elves that Frodo and Sam eat as they advance into Mordor, and which gives them strength, even though you only need a tiny little bit of it, is very reminiscent of Holy Communion, what
Mm,
Tolkien called the Eucharist the one great thing to love on earth. Um, and and people have said, oh, well, isn't that just an allegory of the Eucharist? And Tolkien would say, no, it's not. It's not an allegory. It doesn't stand for it. You don't
mm,
have to. You don't have to equate the lembas bread with the Eucharist in order to understand the story. It's just a dim echo of what Tolkien believed to be an important spiritual reality. It's not a symbol of it. It's yeah, an echo, a reflection, a sort of very, very loose allusion, but not a strict allegory in any
mm,
sense. Because Tolkien's mind didn't work like that. Tolkien really was not writing allegory, um, and says as much in a number of letters, and indeed in the preface to The Lord of the Rings. He says, I have a hearty distaste for allegory. Allegory, he says, resides in the purposed domination of the author. I, the author, see that this means that and that means
mm,
this. And unless you, the reader, pick up on those equivalencies, you're not reading the story properly. Unless you read the Pilgrim's Progress and understand that the journey that Christian is on is not just any old journey between 2 points in space, but is actually reflective of Christian development, you
right,
you're not understanding the Pilgrim's Progress. And
right.
that's not at all the case with the Lord of the Rings. It's not an allegory. It's not. It's rather what Tolkien called applicability. A reader can find in the story any number of elements which they can then apply to things in the real world, but that's something in the freedom of the reader. It's not in the domination of the author. Um, and so there are other, allusions that we could apply, We hear about Eru Iluvatar, who is the one, who is the creator of Middle Earth. That's you can apply that to the God of Christian theology or the God of any number of religions. It doesn't have to
Right.
be
Right.
Christian theology. Or, Galadriel, the elven queen, who is beautiful and gracious and helpful. You can apply her to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And we know that Tolkien also thought that Mary was an important feature of his spirituality. Um, but these connections are
Yeah.
loose. They are connotations rather than strict parallels.
You're stretching your own reality. You're trying to make it maybe more into what certainly he was ever thinking out of it. Now, the fact that you draw that from that on your own, I
Yeah.
guess go get them as you're reading it, but don't think that Tolkien is trying to give you any kind of message about that because he's not. Um,
Well, yes, certainly not in an allegorical way. I mean, it ought to be acknowledged that Tolkien's imagination, his whole frame of being, his cast of mind, was thoroughly steeped in Christian practice. He was a very devout Christian and says so in a number of places. And a lot of people who knew him said, yeah, his faith was at the center of his being.
mhm.
So, and he wrote The Lord of the Rings in a very sort of organic and unplanned way. It took him best part of a decade or more to write the whole thing because he didn't sit down with the whole thing mapped out ahead of
Uh,
time. He didn't plan it. It just gradually sort of emerged, or you might say, it was gestating inside him like
uh,
like an elephant giving birth over many years. Um, and there were times when he sort of wrote himself into a dead end, and he couldn't work out where the story was going to go, and then he just sat on the egg, as it were, waiting for the next bit to develop. And then, a year later, he would find his way forward again. Um, so it's not worked out mentally and intellectually ahead of time. It's just
Interesting.
emerging from his whole being in a very natural and organic fashion. And that, that makes it all the more relevant what his cast of mind and his deep
Mm,
DNA as a human being and as a Christian consisted of. Because what else is he going to write except something that springs out of his Christian beliefs and values?
sure.
But that doesn't mean it's an allegory.
Right.
You can read
Interesting.
it. You can read it in a very pagan way if you want
Hmm.
to, and some people do, and they get rather annoyed when you point out that there are all these Christian echoes, and they don't even know that Tolkien was a Christian. And that's why, again, to refer to my friend Holly Ordway, she's recently written this book, Tolkien's Faith, a spiritual biography, in which, she gives the first ever full biographical account of Tolkien's faith, and shows that it was really at the center of his being. So how could the Lord of the Rings be anything other than,
Right.
in some sense, a Christian work?
Right, right. If he was a practicing Buddhist, there may be another whole, yeah, but that would certainly impact anybody's thought process if that's
Hmm.
what is a part of my kind of my inner being core beliefs. Those things are going
Hmm.
to eke out, right, in various
Yeah,
places and certainly have influence. But it doesn't mean I sat down and thought, okay, we got to get this lion killed and we got to get him alive. Okay. And
yeah,
he's got to come back to life. Okay. And if we don't do that, then we're losing the allegory. And maybe in a way that Lewis might have thought it. Tolkien's not thinking, hey, we got to get the sun rising on the other side and, all the rest of this happening, et cetera. So
yeah,
what a
yeah,
fascinating time period. And I'm so glad that there are people like you and folks like Holly Ordway who connected us and others that are thinking about these things. And that's a part of why we enjoy doing what we do on this podcast and what we do at the Center for Christian History is to be able to connect some of those pieces and to be able to kick that around. Tell us about your book on Planet Narnia. So if we want to
hmm,
dig deeper into that, do we just find it at our regular places that we would go to find books?
yeah,
Or is
yeah,
there some
yeah.
particular place we'd find it?
No, it's available where all good books are sold. Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, Oxford University Press. It's a long book with lots of footnotes. And if you don't like long books with footnotes, then I wrote a shorter, simpler, more accessible version of the same argument, and that goes under the title The Narnia Code.
Mm.
Um, and if you don't even like short and relatively simple books, but prefer to watch television, there's a BBC documentary called The Narnia Code, also an hour-long documentary that the BBC made a few years ago, and that's available on DVD and maybe now streaming, I don't know. Um, so yeah, if you love Narnia, if you love C.S. Lewis, I would encourage you to seek out this argument of mine because though I say it myself, and of course I would say this, wouldn't I? But I really believe that there was a mystery at the heart of the Narnia books, which a lot of people actually sensed. A lot of scholars, not just me, thought there must be more going on in Narnia than meets the
Mm.
eye. All sorts of different theories were suggested, like the seven deadly sins or the seven sacraments as a way of binding the books together more satisfactorily. But for various reasons, it fell to me to come up with the seven heavens. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I think
Mm.
it's really beautiful and subtle, and explains all sorts of oddities in the book. And if we can bring back to the question of C.S. Lewis's own faith, we've talked a lot about Tolkien's, but
Yes.
C.S. Lewis, it must be remembered, was unlike Tolkien. He went through a long period of disbelief, about 2 decades, when he was calling
Mm.
himself an atheist. And when he finally got back into the practice of Christian faith and wrote his first book of Christian apologetics, The Problem of Pain, he begins that book by saying, and this is the very first sentence of the book, not many years ago when I was an atheist,
Mm.
if anyone had asked me, why do you not believe in God? My answer would have gone something like this: look at the universe we live in. And he then goes on to expound on how the universe is inhospitable and cold and dark and bleak and full of cruelty and meaninglessness. And he says, if you ask me to believe that this universe is the work of a good and loving God, I tell you all the evidence points in exactly the opposite direction. That was his belief when he was an atheist.
Hmm.
Then he becomes a Christian, and he soon begins to praise Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God. He says that's the greatest poem in the book of Psalms and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. So far from having thought of the universe as cold and bleak and meaningless, now the heavens are telling the glory of God.
Hmm.
Now, the universe hadn't changed, but Lewis's perspective on it had changed completely. He'd undergone a complete 180-degree revolution in his view of the cosmos. Now, I think that when he was writing Narnia, he deliberately gave the Narnian cosmos a superficial appearance of chaos, you might say. Or we could use the word slapdash or hodgepodge, mishmash, which he was criticized for by various people. All the while, he, C.S. Lewis, knew that there was this inner meaning, that he had his own plans that he was working out, but he wasn't going to make it obvious any more than God makes it irresistibly obvious to us that
Hmm.
he is, in control of history, that God is working his purposes out, and all things work together for good for those who love God. There's plenty of evidence to the contrary, but a Christian believer thinks no, the right interpretation of this cosmos is the Christian one,
Right.
despite all appearances to the contrary. And so I think that Lewis is to Narnia as God is to the real world.
Uh,
Lewis is the God of the Narnian universe, and he makes his plans just obvious enough for scholars to sniff them out, but not so obvious that the every reader is hit over the head with these meanings.
right.
In other
It's
words,
not all the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are easy to, maybe not always easy to do them. Hopefully you're not murdering anybody, right? But it's not real hard. Do these things, don't do these things. Boom, it's laid out.
yeah,
Now, let's dip off into some other theological components and try to figure out if predestination is real or not. He didn't give us all of that, right? He let us be kicking around the edges to try to figure that one out. I mean,
Yeah.
kind of some of that same way, where I'm not just going to lay out for you very specifically, this is the whole Narnia world and this is it. Let me let you chew on this and be able to kind of see as you read it and go through it.
Well, yeah, exactly. And, Jesus himself, the Son of God, God the Son, did not make his divine identity irresistibly obvious.
Hmm.
Even some of his own disciples doubt him even after the resurrection.
Right.
Um, so, in other words, God is interested in a relationship with us that is based on freedom and love, not on power and coercion.
Mm.
God could make us all fall down in abject prostration before him by a, irresistible manifestation of his power. But where would be the freedom and the love in that? So God accommodates himself to our finitude and our weakness and our limitations, showing us just enough that we seek after him and want him, but not so much that the question is answered ahead of time. We've got to want him, and if we seek, we will find. If we knock, the door will be answered. Um, but it's partly up to us.
Wow. So great, man. I'm so fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with us to learn more about this. For those of you are watching this or listening to this, we hope that you'll click back over on the Center for Christian History.com and learn more about the resources and the other things that we are developing through the center. Continue to listen and like and give good thumbs up, if you will, to our podcast. Things like that help and matter when people are searching for good content and good information just like this. Dr. Michael Ward, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Nick. Thanks for having me. Bye bye.